We're living in a digital world. All around us are connected devices recording, using, communicating our data. And we trust that this is secure. We have to. And there's been heavy investment in tools, training, processes and technologies to bolster this security. And yet we're hearing daily reports of security failures, new vulnerabilities, hacks, breaches. What's going on? Where do we keep getting it wrong? My name's Sam Pumphrey. I'm Head of Digital Security at Cambridge Consultants. I'd like to talk briefly about our views on how flaws fundamentally arise, why we keep making mistakes, and what can be done. Cambridge Consultants is a product development and engineering company. We've got about 850 scientists, engineers, and designers worldwide, creating innovative technologies for our ambitious clients in a range of sectors. And given this focus, I'll be concentrating on the flaws that enter through the design and development process for new systems. But most of the points are relevant across all applications of security. First, a quick show of hands. Who thinks that security is an issue worth caring about? Good. Not everyone, but that's good for this audience. Obviously we're increasingly reliant on digital systems in almost every sector: healthcare, government, commerce, industry. Those systems are increasingly connected and the data is increasingly centralized. And the threat is at unprecedented levels and still increasing. Security is important. Another quick show of hands. Who thinks we've got it well under control? Nobody? Well, it's maybe not as bad as all that. The evidence suggests that it is still a problem. This is just a few examples from recent weeks. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but it's clear that even and perhaps especially some of the things we rely on most are vulnerable. And the number of vulnerabilities is trending upwards as well. Partly this is that we're actually working harder at finding them and getting better at finding them, but there's still a fairly bottomless supply of vulnerabilities. However, it's not all doom and gloom. The whole point of this talk is actually there's some great emerging solutions out there. We're often just not using them or even thinking about needing them. And my hope is that this presentation gives some positive messages in what's often a negatively handled subject, and some cause for optimism and positive actions as a way forward. In our view, security flaws come from one of four things: human errors, process errors, conscious decisions, and mistaken assumptions. Some things make security harder. Legacy systems, the sheer complexity of the problem space, it'd be very difficult to prove whether you've made something secure or not. But flaws creep in from one of those four, to wit. Human errors. This is basic, simple mistakes in the design or development or test of the system, getting maths wrong or poor configuration of some of the tools. You knew what should have been done, it just didn't work out that way. And some of the fixes potentially for that are around additional training, tools, and testing. Next, process errors. This effectively is often not even thinking about security at all, but sometimes you've got a process, but you're taking on too much or too little, losing sight of priorities, not keeping on top of changes in the environment around your development, or missing critical steps in a process. Verification, or starting too late, fundamentally assuming you can sprinkle on security at the end. This used to be a huge problem. It's getting much better. There's now a range of good processes, standards that organizations can adopt, and we're seeing uptake of those increasing. Security is no longer a nice to have, it's essential. The third is conscious decisions, and this is where you're actually leaving or even creating a flaw when balanced against the other requirements for a system. These are usually not major, they're usually well-managed risks, and so no additional actions are really needed. But if you're not consciously leaving some flaw somewhere, then I suspect there's probably something wrong with your processes or priorities. And finally, and crucially, mistaken assumptions. Often that something can't or won't happen. Even if you get everything right, you follow a strong process, and you weren't intending to leave any vulnerabilities. This is where a bad assumption can just leave you with gaping vulnerabilities in the system. And they're so easy to make and hard to shake, and many people don't even think about or question the assumptions. Now, again, I'm not offering a silver bullet solution here, but 9/10 of the problem is unknown unknowns here. And being aware of just some of the potentially flawed assumptions can get you a long way and avoid you building a shining tower on some very shaky foundations. If I could offer just one takeaway from this talk, it's to start thinking about and questioning your assumptions. But how? We undertook a review of some of the assumptions fundamentally driving the flaws and failures we've seen both in published cases and from our own experience of developing and securing connected devices. There were quite a large number of fairly diverse assumptions, but these clustered and grouped under 5 broad categories. Assuming someone else has checked this, that you don't need to do it yourself. Assuming that some aspect of the internals of the system can't be accessed or modified. Assuming that the secrets remain secret. Assuming that essential components won't fail. And assuming that security by design will naturally endure. These are broad classes. Let's look at the next level down. Odd things with colours. Lots more detail here under the hood. There's not time to go through it all. Some of these are commonly known, but I'll point out 7 that you might not be as familiar with. First, it's commonly assumed amongst developers that the compiler is to some degree your friend. It helps you identify and address issues and security issues in your code. And if it compiles, it's good to release. But while there are some tools to help you identify unsafe code, and some languages are better than others, this is generally a dangerous assumption. Compilers don't check for security flaws in general, and for instance, even been known to remove security features from your code around memory blanking or timing protection code. What can you do? Understand your compiler's limitations and validate the resulting code. Don't just assume it's done what you expected. Second, long-standing and very dangerous assumption is that your memory can't be observed, source code can't be read by a potential attacker. This leads to very risky design decisions around hard-coded secrets in unprotected memory. And with bugs like heartbleed and speculative execution flaws still happening, ways of physically accessing data in memory, or powerful decompilation tools like the NSA Git are freely available, this is just not a safe assumption. How to fix this? Look at using specialized hardware functions and proper crypto. Don't rely on security through obscurity. Third, and sort of related, but programmers often assume that the code is going to execute as they expect. It's a single thread of execution, every instruction operates as planned. In reality, there can be multiple threads of execution interacting, errors can occur, the control flow could be externally manipulated in some way, bits in transit could be modified, resulting in severe flaws. As an example from last year, some code in encrypted solid-state drives from several vendors actually fell to most basic attack. They had left the JTAG debug port open, and a security researcher was able to go in and simply change the result of a password verification check from fail to pass, and the whole disk was opened up. Now, this is a really bad cryptographic design, amongst other things, but the designer just probably didn't even think about the fact that their code and its execution might be manipulated in that way. To handle that, use trusted execution environments, secured hardware, thread-safe systems and languages, fault-tolerant design when necessary, and please disable the debug before releasing the product. Another common but dangerous assumption is that once trusted, an entity should always be trusted. Often a lot of effort goes into building the trust in a device before it can communicate or interact with a community. But very little thought goes into how that's going to be maintained over time, or revoking it if that becomes necessary. As an early example, the PGP Web of Trust model, it had no concept of expiry or revocation at all. So that once a certificate was signed, it was always valid, and that makes no sense. The secrets behind that identity could be lost or stolen, or that fundamental trustedness of that subject might change over time. Trust is a very dynamic thing, and the systems for managing it must be dynamic too. Plan for detection and revocation, and consider as well that the device and maybe the community trust life cycles may differ. You may need multiple identities here. Fifth, it's commonly assumed that third-party components haven't been compromised. Whether silicon components or software, this is generally a very risky assumption. Last year's British Airways hack, for example, and other hacks by the MageCart group, they involved a third-party JavaScript component loaded into the payment page, and it was able to scrape all the details of payments from that page. And it was modified on a site that had weaker security than the main site. And it was just loaded in and simply assumed that it was working as expected, that it hadn't been modified. If it matters, check, check, check again, and minimize use of untested third-party components in critical areas. Sixth, security architects may do everything right, but assume that getting the architecture right is enough. Now, I'm not saying security by design is a bad thing. I'd probably get lynched if I said that here. But it's just not enough to have good design. You need to ensure that everyone involved in implementing and operating and maintaining the system also understand that design and understand enough not to accidentally subvert the security measures you're trying to build in. As an example, there's a number of cases where the security of the system is dependent on there being an air gap between various systems, and for whatever reason, expediency, ease of use, or otherwise, somebody bridges that gap. You see that time and time again. And as a specific example, the automotive CAN bus. Now, this was never really designed with security in mind, but actually it's relatively safe when kept physically isolated. And then someone somewhere decides it'd be a great idea to stick a wireless entertainment system with a whole bunch of vulnerabilities and connect it up into the CAN bus. And then you're left with the same sort of problems that Jeep had in 2015 when someone was able to completely take over control of the vehicle. The fix here is not a technology fix. It needs good, clear documentation and processes to manage the security of a product through its entire lifetime. This isn't new in the high security world. People have been doing this for years, but in the commercial world, many don't think about it, and it has a commercial implication. Finally, going back to someone else has checked this area, it's often assumed that simply plugging together secure components will result in a secure whole. And this is a risky assumption. As an example, a bit of a toy example really, but you might have a system protecting credit card numbers with several components, each of which protects that number through redacting digits of the card number. But if they're different components, each redact different digits, then the whole number can be revealed. You can't just assume that all components will seamlessly work together, will follow the same security model and work together to provide security. Anytime you're integrating systems, you need to look at the wider system architecture and consider global questions around things like keys and identities and how they're going to be managed. So we've identified a whole load of risky assumptions that we might unconsciously make and various fixes, but what can we do in general? What have we learned? Well, there is no single solution. The most important thing is to grow awareness of your assumptions and consider their impact and plan appropriate controls. Some ways of addressing some of the common assumptions have started to become fairly mainstream technologies and strategies. You may well have come across zero trust, trusted execution environments, chips with secure boot, and so on. These are all hugely valuable. But technology only gets you so far. Other key points include layering security, defects and depth effectively, documenting and managing the security through the whole life cycle of the system, and focusing tests around areas of greatest potential impact. And importantly, don't just consider what's likely, but what can happen and work to that. Your assumptions may be wrong. So, in summary, security problems arise due to human errors, process errors, conscious decisions, and mistaken assumptions. Yes, you need tools, training, testing. Yes, develop strong processes, and yes, adopt new technology and layered defenses. But you also need to think about whether you're making risky assumptions. Use checklists and or engage with experts who can challenge those assumptions and open your eyes to the things you don't know. Thank you.